Welcome, everybody. Hope folks are enjoying the conference so far. We have heard great things. We're excited that you chose to join us for this 1 hour session. We're hoping that we don't spend too much time talking at you and that you have plenty of time to ask questions. And the goal is to make it interactive. So we'll get started. We'll do the talking at you part really quickly. And just so we're all aware what session we joined. So Rick and I are going to be talking about attracting and hiring great technical talent into the government and the public sector. Before we get started on this, Rick and I are going to introduce ourselves so you're not talking to total strangers. And we'll kind of talk about the shape of our conversation today and what that's going to look like. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions and comments, anything that you guys need that's going to be valuable. So with that, we'll just kick it off with quick introductions. I'm Phoebe Peranto. I'm the Deputy Chief Technology Innovation Officer at the state of California, which is like a really long title. Essentially, I work with Rick on leading our innovation and digital services efforts at the state of California. Rick Clow.
Thanks, Phoebe. I have the pleasure of working alongside Phoebe, have been at the state for the last 18 months. Prior to that, had a long career in the private sector. Most recently was on the Google campus for 13, almost 14 years.
Fantastic. Okay. So as promised, let's talk a little bit about the shape of our conversation today. So welcome and intros, you know who we are now. We are going to talk about the office that we lead because we find that that context is really helpful for grounding a lot of the content that we'll discuss today. Then we'll talk about the problem. And this is probably a problem you all intimately face every day. So if we're saying things you already know, please just fire up the chat and let us know you agree around how challenging it can be, right, to hire and attract amazing people, especially into digital roles and technical roles within the government. Then we'll share our specific experience with this in the state of California with trying to revamp what that hiring process looks like, while still working within the confines of, the government apparatus and rules and regulations. And then finally, and we're hoping that this is the most valuable part of our conversation, some takeaways that we find are relatively transferable to other organizations, to regardless if you're state, local, federal, to start making change tomorrow as you think about potentially the large volume of hires that you might have coming up. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Rick Clow to talk a little bit more about our office and what we do and who we are.
Thanks, Phoebe. So we are responsible for leading the Office of Enterprise Technology, OET for short. We are one of the offices at the California Department of Technology. My introduction to OET came first through a volunteer role. I got introduced to then State CIO Amy Tong, who is now the Secretary of Government Operations, our parent agency. And I was brought in to help work on some of the data and systems around the vaccination effort. I was in that first few weeks as a volunteer that Amy told me about this Office of Enterprise Technology that she was looking for someone to lead. And I pushed back because I'm not an enterprise technology guy. I was a consumer software, consumer internet kind of guy. But she went on to explain, no, this is really the software development, product development arm of the state of California. Our responsibility is to build and ship products at scale for departments and agencies across the state. Today, we are 80, almost 90 people. I was telling someone this morning, we look a lot like the teams I used to lead at Google. Software engineers, DevSecOps engineers, data analysts, geospatial specialists, UI, UX researchers, product managers, web developers. I'm missing a number of other components of our team. And we work together to try and work on some of the most important, impactful projects that often have a fairly compressed time horizon. So we are known for the work that we did last year, building the digital vaccine record for the state of California. We then released that code to the public domain so that now other states have deployed our code for their residents. We're also in the process of building out a digital identity stack. We have a number of people working on the state's broader Broadband for All initiative. We have a transformation stabilization team that is actively working to assess critical systems throughout the state, make sure they're more resilient. We have a bunch more going on under the OET tent. At the end of the day, you can see the headline there at the top. That really describes what our office is asked to do every day. And it's in that context that the rest of this session, we will talk about some of the hiring challenges we faced last fall and what we did to address them.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. And to make sure that we fully set up the problem, Rick is going to couch this for us so that we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I just described some of who we are and the kinds of people that we have on the OET team. I don't need to tell anyone in this room just how many different times and scenarios and contexts the challenge of putting the right technical talent to the need can be, particularly if those people aren't already in the room. It's one thing to be able to engage outside volunteers on an ongoing basis, but as we saw at the federal level with a number of initiatives, what we've seen within the state with recent issues between drought, fire, floods, not to mention the COVID vaccination campaign and the subsequent work on the vaccine rollout, the vaccine record rollout. We need the same types of people that are often going to Google and Apple and Twitter and Amazon and Microsoft, not to mention countless startups. And it was in that context that we had to think about getting creative to both find the people willing to come to work for us and then actually get them through the process of getting them hired.
Awesome. And it's a little bit of a catch-22, right? Because Rick mentioned this, right? This is probably not a new problem for a lot of people here. And yet we're faced with these constraints where the government is kind of structured to balance risk and speed, and that can often result in slowing down a process. And so we face a lot of limitations just because we are in the public sector, despite the fact that, to Rick's excellent point, the demand for really excellent technical talent is sky high right now. And the speed with which the government needs that talent is faster than it's ever been before. I mean, just to call out a few points from the California perspective, I mean, I think we've all faced, a long time to hire. That's something that's just very common in the government. When Rick and I came in, we did some digging on what it was in the state of California, and it's about 6 months from the moment that someone submits an application to the time that they sign an offer. So end to end, which is, by anyone's standards, not particularly fast. I think you're also in this position where not only are you not able to move at the same speed as the private sector, you're also not able to compensate people in the same way. And the reason that people join the public sector is usually quite mission driven, values oriented, and yet, despite that, salaries are attractive and people live in expensive places. And so oftentimes you're losing really phenomenal candidates. Yeah, exactly, Beth. Yeah, there's no bonus, there's no equity, right? So when you look at the incentive alignment, it is disproportionate, we'll say, from the private sector. And to Rick's excellent point, you want people who were originally going to go to Amazon and Meta and Google and great startups. And so you're faced with this challenge of how do we get those people without being able to give them all of the perks and the benefits and the financial incentives that those organizations can offer. I think something that's more specific to the public sector, and we face this here at the state of California, is that job classifications are specific and they can be limiting, right? And there can be demands for what a specific type of role requires when it comes to years of experience or demonstrated capability. And occasionally those classifications will not mature with the types of roles that we're looking to hire for. And so there's kind of a lack of evolution in those, and then you might not be hiring exactly for the right role that you're looking for. And then finally, the application process, this is probably obvious to everyone, is extremely opaque and it's difficult to navigate. I will say, as someone who came from the private sector, who was at Google and Salesforce, there were vocabulary words that I'd never seen before in the application process. I didn't know what they mean and what they meant. There's also, specifics around font sizes and how long specific answers should be to questions. And if you are familiar with the public sector, then a lot of this is going to be familiar to you. But if we're looking for folks who might have an expanded purview outside of the public sector, maybe bringing folks in from the private sector, we make it extra hard for them to better understand how to apply to the government in any form or fashion and make it easy and transparent. So these are just a handful of the limitations. I'm sure that if we asked this group to come up with a list, it would be infinitely long. But you will see us address some of these specific constraints as we walk through the California state experience, because we found these to be the most prominent when we went through the experience. So let's talk a little bit about what we did within the state of California, but I'll set it up first so that everyone has an understanding of kind of what we faced. And Rick alluded to this, so everyone is primed. So late last year, our team was about 60. We had 30 plus open roles, which is a lot of open roles. It wasn't just open roles, it was a need for staffing really essential projects within our organization. And Rick shared this. I mean, we're working on things like the digital COVID vaccine record that's very timely, it's urgent, it needs people. We're working on other initiatives outside of that that are of equal importance and priority and need to be staffed appropriately. And so we didn't have a full bench, we'll say that. So we were tasked I want to say in October or November of 2021 with filling all of those vacancies within 5 to 8 weeks, which sounds nuts. I mean, coming from the private sector, I thought that was an infinite amount of time, but here that was like the speediest way that you could possibly fill those roles. And I just want to be very clear. We were using all of the existing resources we had at our disposal. We were not given more HR support. We were working within the confines of the existing HR set of rules and regulations. So no one was making exceptions for us. We were just operating within the existing structure to try to get this done. So this is my favorite part, but Rick's going to walk us through our strategy and kind of how we thought through this problem and executed.
So at the highest level, we communicated to our team. Phoebe and I have a handful of leaders, each of whom run a piece of the larger office. And we made it very clear that this was the most important thing we were working on in Q4. Technically, it was Q2 of the fiscal year, but I still think in private sector terms, so this was October to December, this was Q4. And that may sound trivial, but if you've been around teams who are often used to a default firefighting mode where everything is always important, and whichever person on the org chart that is most senior happened to communicate a request, well, that's the important thing today. That was the environment we found ourselves in. And just by declaring to our leaders that there was nothing they were working on or their teams that was more important than hiring, created space for people to think about how they spent their day. This was the first time many people within our office had ever heard that it was appropriate to push a deliverable back to prioritize interviewing. Because we did the math. If we were going to hire 30 people, we were probably going to interview between 100 and 150 people for those roles. And if we were going to interview between 100 and 150 people for those roles, we were probably going to look at 500 or more applicants over a period of a couple of months. And the only way we could create capacity to actually tackle that was to make it clear that other things were fungible. And you could explain to your manager, I didn't deliver on this thing this week because I was on 4 interview panels. That was a fantastic. When we would hear that from our leadership, that was a sign that they had internalized this North Star that we had declared and made it clear that they had permission to make this an actual priority. I mean, I won't read every one of these bullets to you. I'll hit a few of the highlights that I think are really critical, and I'm going to brag on Phoebe here for a minute. Specifically, this mapping the hiring process end to end. When we asked, how do people get hired at the state? We heard snippets from different people about their piece of the puzzle that they were responsible for and or had visibility to. What didn't exist anywhere was one document in one page that declared this is the life cycle of a candidate from the day they see a job application to the day that they are hired. And in fact, there's steps prior to that because, of course, once we know there's a vacancy, we've got to get a job approved, we got to get it posted. So no one had documented that life cycle. I could probably do this as a poll. I won't make you spend time on it. We could ask you, how many steps do you think that process had end to end? If you guessed 24, you would be in the ballpark. And it was only when we had that full map of 23, 4, 5, something like that, steps, that we could then map every opening, all 30 of them, to where they were in that stage, in that process. And then every week we reviewed 30 positions times 25 stages with our leadership, with attribution, so everybody knew which teams were making progress and which teams were making less, and with HR. Because as it turns out, a number of those stages weren't being parallel processed and could have been. So just by shining a light on it and then proactively reviewing with HR to say, hey, we've got 6 positions that are waiting on this person's approval. Can we do these things in parallel? Since it seems like 100% of the approvals we've asked for, we've gotten historically. So can we just sort of anticipate that that's going to happen so that we can start running down reference checks, et cetera? And in doing that, we compressed, as Phoebe said, 6 months per hire, which, do the math, it's 180 months that it would have taken, obviously not serially, to have filled all those positions cumulatively. We compressed that to, where did we land, Phoebe? I think 6 weeks was the average across all of the 30 positions that we hired.
Yeah, about 6 to 7 weeks, yeah.
So there are a few points in here that our team is probably tired of hearing us talk about. But it was critical that we started with the end in mind, that we made it clear that we have a goal here. The goal is not interview lots of people. The goal was eliminate our vacancy rate. We had one of the highest vacancy rates of all of the teams within the Department of Technology. We wanted to have the lowest vacancy rate. So being entirely outcome oriented and metrics driven was critical because there was no confusion about what we were doing or why. And in our experience, as we have worked on a number of projects around and throughout government, that as a starting point was critical. Because once that was in place, the rest of the team, they all were looking at the same thing, and they all could understand at any point in the process, were we making progress towards that goal or not? And if not, what needed to change in order to pick up the pace? I want to be really clear. There are still things in this process that could be so much better. But we needed to focus on the things we had control over instead of simply pointing at the other stuff that was either broken or ineffective and say, look, we just can't do anything about that. Those things are still true, and we could still make this better. But in the end, we actually hit our goal. And I think by the end of the quarter, we had maybe 4 positions open that hadn't been filled, give or take. I'm sure we'll have questions and answers about sort of what else or picking at some of the details. But that, in a nutshell, was how we leaned into the opportunity. I was absolutely thrilled to have our leadership tell us, above us, sort of Russ, who at the time was the deputy CIO, Amy, who was the CIO, to give us a very aggressive goal. Because that helped focus everyone else's energy. There's one other point in here I want to talk about, because I think we've seen this misused in the private sector, and that has to do with the employee referrals. So we have all heard stories, or I imagine you've heard stories, about tell us who your network is so that we can recruit them, so that we can fill existing roles. And what that ends up doing is perpetuating whatever the demographics are of the team that you're currently leading. So if everybody looks like me, the people you hire are probably going to look like me, which is not at all what we want. Certainly wasn't what we wanted to perpetuate as we looked at this tremendous opportunity to sort of intentionally build the team we wanted to have. We wanted the best people, but by definition, best was also people that didn't necessarily look like me. So we did a couple of things, some of which were constrained by rules around collective bargaining agreements and arrangements between the state and unions about what we can or can't do in terms of how we look for talent, how we recruit. That said, we were able to do a few things that I think really helped us. First off, we invited our team to, I think it was a Google form, tell us who the best people whose work you've ever observed are. They don't have to be former coworkers, just who do you admire? Who have you seen get good work done, either in the state, in the private sector, both, don't care. And if you're willing to have us use your name, tell us that. So our team at the time was about 50 people, give or take. We got a list of at least that many, probably closer to 60, 70 names. And Phoebe and I reached out to every single one of those people, not to specifically recruit them for a job that had been posted, but to introduce ourselves. Here's the team that we've built. Here's the kind of work that we do. We're about to be hiring at a pace that this group has never hired before. So if you or someone you think highly of is looking, here is a link that will always surface the jobs that we are currently hiring for. Share it wherever you feel comfortable, because if you think highly of someone, you are someone our team thinks highly of, then I trust anybody you refer to us. Both Phoebe and I come from the private sector. The places that we have worked tend not to be terribly hierarchical. I had countless meetings with the founders at Google and senior execs at Google. Like, yes, those were great days, but I was never so blown away that I was speechless. In the act of Phoebe and I reaching out to a number of these people, many of whom had never heard from someone at our level in the state org chart, the impact was extraordinary. We heard from nearly everyone we reached out to, had one-on-one meetings with almost every one of them. And the halo effect of them now being aware of who we were and what we were doing, and their willingness to point people our way, helped fill the funnel at the top with people who might recognize, boy, they can't pay what I might make somewhere else, but they seem to be doing something that's interesting and compelling in a way that I haven't seen done before, at least in this environment. So that's enough of the particulars. We certainly are happy to answer any questions on other stuff we did. There are some takeaways from this that I think Phoebe's going to walk us through that I think are equally important for what we learned.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick. You teed me up like a total pro. My gosh. I do recognize that not all organizations are created equal, and that we at OET might have some beneficial circumstances versus other groups, right? We did have leadership that was equally as invested in our pursuit of filling these roles, and that's something that we certainly don't take for granted. So I do want to say, like, we understand that there are different circumstances across different organizations. My hope is that these are largely transferable. And these are learnings that Rick and I, over many weeks hiring, have come to the conclusion of. And so the first is kind of my favorite Rick Clowism, which is determine what is a rule and what is a convention. And when we first started trying to better understand the hiring process at the state, which does have 23 marvelous steps to it, what we were trying to understand is which of those steps are actually statutorily required? Are they like legally required? And or what parts of the process are mandated versus what is a widely held convention that people uphold because it's always been the way we've done things, but isn't necessarily required. And so a few things we learned were around, and this might sound so boring to people, but it sped up our process, was that we would need to email documentation to HR every time we did a specific thing. And it just so happens that that's a convention. What's actually required is pretty minimal when it comes to reporting back to HR. There are specific regulations around what they need. But outside of that, it was just creating time in this process because folks had told us, well, that's the way we do it. And so we started to ask why a lot more as we were understanding this process. And it so happened that a lot of the things that we thought were rules were actually just observed practices. And so that really helped us determine areas for efficiency or parallel processing. So if you're ever curious what happens when you ask why in this process, I encourage you to do it because it's very illuminating and it will speed you up pretty immediately. The second thing that I think is very doable and is helpful, and some people don't find this helpful, but I'm more of a systems thinker. And so what I wanted to make sure we understood in our office was the hiring process end to end, right? From the point of view of the hiring manager, not necessarily from the point of view of the candidate. While that is critical, to Rick's point earlier, we don't have a lot of control over the process from the point of view of the candidate. I wish we could, because that would create a lot more transparency and it would reduce the opacity of a very long process. What we do have control over is what our hiring managers are doing and how they interact with HR. And so I mapped this out end to end. It's every step in the process, what's required, who owns it. And that was an incredible exercise. I actually did it on my wall in my office, which might have been a little too beautiful mind for people. But at the end of the day, I think it was the right thing to do, because what we noticed was that we could consolidate a lot of those steps into a single thing. We had previously been told at a widely held convention that HR would need to approve our interview questions before we went and interviewed. That's a convention. They don't necessarily have to do that. That's a courtesy. And so we were waiting days for HR to get back to us on those look good, no problem. And we immediately cut out 3 to 4 days in that process, right? Which in the grand scheme of 6 months doesn't seem like a lot, but it's going to compound over time because you have 23 steps in this process. Imagine that you could start to eliminate, maybe 50% of those steps. So mapping out that process end to end was, I think, for a lot of us very valuable, because it gave everyone on our team a visual map of where they sat, what they were responsible for, and where their candidates currently lived in the funnel. This is something that Rick mentioned, and I can't emphasize this enough, is talent referrals and building a pipeline. I know this is one side of it. The other side of it is being able to hire for those great people. And we all know the constraints and limitations on that. However, Rick and I had this opportunity to not only educate folks who had never even heard of our office. They were in the private sector, or they were in the state of California and they had still never heard of our office. We had an opportunity to educate around what we do, and also to talk about the value proposition of working in the public sector and coming to the public sector. And, we talked about this earlier, the challenge of trying to match the perks and expectations and financial incentives that the private sector is able to offer people and really excellent candidates. And this was our moment to articulate why we had decided to join the public sector, to make it very clear what the value proposition of our team was and how we operate. So it kind of served as a twofold outcome for us. And I mean, finally, it also helped bolster our team's confidence. When people are asked about other wonderful people they've worked with before, they are thrilled to tell you about them, thrilled. And they're really honored that you asked. And so I think it was just truly the act of posing that to the group, because it implies we have deep trust in our employees. People were so willing to make hiring a broad priority for their teams, primarily because we had instilled this sense of confidence in them that they were the right people to prioritize this. And then I'll finish up quickly so that we can answer some great questions. Declare your goals. I mean, Rick and I would come into meetings and we would immediately vocally commit. We're doing this. This is the time frame we're doing it within. And we would constantly do that as kind of messaging reinforcement, specifically with really key stakeholders. This was really critical. I think that one of my biggest concerns, I won't lump Rick in, was that we would kind of get to the 11th hour on our hiring timeline and the expectations set for us by leadership, and we would have to activate all of these people and stakeholders that we hadn't previously activated. And it would slow down our process even more. And so by declaring up front what we were ostensibly trying to do, which I think Rick can attest to this, a lot of people said, like, good luck to you, right? Like, hope it works. It didn't matter because the least that we could do was create some type of visibility around what our team was doing, such that when we came in and we had ambitious goals around this and actions that we needed to take, people understood the motivations. And then finally, we talked about this, but truly making it a team-wide priority and giving people the space and the permission to say, I'm going to deprioritize this other thing because I'm hiring, was something that I think was really key for our team, and for them to realize that this priority would make them better at their jobs, right? They're going to be fully staffed. OET is going to have the staff they need. We're going to have the resourcing that's required so that people can execute on the outcomes that Rick and I expect of them. So it's very full circle. And I would say, you know, at the end of the day, every organization is different. I mean, my personal opinion is if you take nothing away from this, except one thing, it would truly be to just understand the process that you're working within, because that in and of itself will illuminate areas for potential efficiency. And it really does work, I promise. And we'll close with a quote, because who doesn't love a quote? Megan Smith, who used to work with Rick and me at Google, who used to be the CTO, the federal CTO. She said this, and I love this quote because I think it's something that I certainly leveraged when we were talking to our early pipeline candidates, when we had reached out for employer referrals. It's go where you're rare and go where you're common. And when she explains what she means by this, it kind of perfectly encapsulates the value proposition of joining the public sector coming from the private sector. And so what she's saying here is go where your skills are needed and differentiated. So in this way, you can deliver outsized value, right? And outsized impact, which is something that I think a lot of people from the private sector want to be doing when they come into the public sector. I know I did. But with that, also go where an organization can move and execute at your pace and has the same values that you have and the same shared principles. And Rick and I emphasize this a lot at OET. I mean, we function very similarly to a startup, and that's the type of person we're looking for. We're looking for people who want to execute at speed, who have the same values and principles we do. And so I always find this is a really helpful encapsulated value proposition when you're talking to especially private sector folks who are looking to come into the public sector. So with that, we will take any questions that people have. We are super transparent folks, so anything that you want to ask, we welcome it. And if no one has questions, then I will invent questions.
Yeah, we've got a bunch that have come in, Phoebe, as you were wrapping up.
Oh my gosh. Oh yes. Oh, the Q&A.
Yep. I was looking at the chat. And I'm like, boy, they've been super quiet. And then I realized, no, the Q&A is where the action is.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Phoebe, you've been talking. Do you want to take one, or do you want to take?
Oh my gosh, Cloud, go for it.
So, Beth asked how much of being in California was an advantage to us. So I would say it was a qualified advantage. On the one hand, the lack of competitive compensation is particularly punitive given the ridiculous cost of living that we have here in California. I would say that that makes it that much more difficult for someone if they're living, I live here in the Bay Area, having commuted to Google for 13 years. Houses here on a government salary are impossible to imagine how to make that work. That said, because of COVID, it created a situation where the state for the first time is open to remote telework, where we now can hire people from anywhere in the state. The in the state part is a relatively new rule that's come out from CalHR. But what that means is up until COVID hit, you had to be in the office in Sacramento 5 days a week. And any exceptions to that were highly unusual. That is no longer the case. Our department, the Department of Technology, is committed to full-time telework. So Phoebe lives in the Bay Area. I live in the Bay Area. One of the women that we hired is down in Los Angeles. So we are no longer a Sacramento-only group, and that has been a tremendous advantage. I think there are people who might have considered working for the government here in California who wouldn't have considered commuting to Sacramento or relocating to Sacramento, that became an advantage to us. Beyond that, I think my advice to other states, the skills that we solve for, that we are indexing for, are the same skills that any university with a computer science department or any large employer that has an internal IT department are almost certainly going to be producing people with those skills. So while it may not be the same concentration of talent like exists in Silicon Valley, I don't see that as an absolute barrier. I think if anything, you take a Fortune 500 employer whose work may not be particularly resonant for people who are mission driven or impact focused, I would think you have a tremendous advantage by being able to show them how their skill set can apply in ways where the fruits of their labor might be much more visible. So that Mark, that one is done. Phoebe, did you see a question in there you wanted to tackle right away?
Yes. All I can say is plus 100 to everything that you just said, Rick. There is a question here on how do you map from traditional government job classifications to common titles in the private sector. It seems like most tech roles are listed as IT, which has a much different connotation in the private tech industry. Okay, I love this question. I'm going to partially answer it because I think that there is another part of this question that is directly related to job classifications and changing those classifications to better reflect what the roles are. And that is an ongoing effort in a lot of states. So I would say, as well as within California, that is an ongoing effort. However, there are things that you can do that are pretty lightweight. So for example, at the state of California, there is one individual who runs recruiting efforts, which mostly translates into job fairs and career fairs, which has its own place and is very helpful. But this particular role also cross-posts all of our roles to LinkedIn and other job boards. And I was noticing that when those roles were posted, they would say exactly that. They would say ITM1, engineering. Like, you're coming from the private sector. What does that even mean? Like, it's nonsense words, right? And so we started asking if we could just post the job title, which you can make anything you want. And so what we started doing, what Rick and I found to be more effective, was that we would make the job titles actually descriptive around what the person was doing, and therefore more transferable to the private sector. So instead of ITM1 or ITS1, you see product manager or project manager or lead engineer. And that was certainly more impactful when it came to allowing for a broader reach when it came to eyeballs that would see these things. Now, that's not a total fix, but if your organization does allow for that and there is no specificity around what is actually listed as the job title, then that would be my recommendation. Easy, super low hanging fruit, because I agree that job classifications, especially for folks in the private sector, are just, I mean, it's all Greek, right? It's very confusing.
I'm sorting my list of questions by popularity, so I'll tackle the diversity question.
Oh, great. Yeah.
What were the diversity results of your hiring initiative? Did your hires look like the people you already had? Did any diversity goals run alongside your overall hiring goals, and/or was it just an overall intention? So I alluded to this a little bit in my comments earlier. I had a number of conversations with our HR department to learn exactly what I could or could not do. And as it turns out, there was a lot I couldn't do. I couldn't state, for instance, language that I took for granted in my prior hiring in the private sector, where I would say, wherever I would post a job, that diversity of candidate pool, diversity of team is a primary goal, and that we want people who may not be, who are underrepresented on our team currently, to seek out roles, because that language was believed to be suggesting, and again, these are not my words, this is what I was told, that might be indicating that we would take criteria into our hiring that did not have to do with who the best candidate was. So I decided I would fight that battle another day and instead focus on how can I ensure that our candidate pool is as large and varied as possible, so that as we go through the candidate screening process, the likelihood of the interviewees and the finalists are likely to be representative was much higher. And I would say that the end result actually was quite positive. I don't have the current team demographic numbers, and as I'm saying this, I'm actually embarrassed to say I don't have the exact demographics of the team at my fingertips. I can say, as I think about the roles that I know we filled over the last several months, that they were a very diverse group of hired people. So it wasn't that it was the candidate pool was diverse, but the finalists were not. I actually feel like the end result was a positive outcome, given the constraints that we had.
Yeah, I love that answer. I'm trying to see. There's a question from Justin on what role was the most challenging to recruit for. I'll give my point of view, Rick. I'd love your point of view on this too, because we might share a different perspective. I don't know. And Justin, I might adjust your question to what role is the most challenging to recruit for, because I think we still face this today. And I would say anything that is tangential or directly a product manager. That is very difficult to hire for. There are a lot of different reasons for that. If I were to prioritize those reasons, I would say, one, job classifications are very challenging to accommodate when it comes to a product manager, because product managers typically are not deep IT experts, but yet extremely necessary in the work we do. I think the second being that we live in California with a bunch of tech companies here, and there are so many options for excellent product managers to go to that, despite the shared mission and the high degree of impact that you can have being in the public sector, there are other incentives that are more attractive. I think that, ultimately at the end of the day, this is a nut we just haven't cracked. We want to be able to, there's kind of a third component of this that I want to make sure that, is surfaced, at least from the California perspective. I'd be curious to know if this is the case across other government entities and organizations, is that there is this perspective here that product management and project management are one and the same. And they are, as most of us here know, the entirely different disciplines. And so being able to make the business case for product managers is a little bit more like pushing a rock uphill, just because you're also required to educate and change a mindset. And so that has been challenging. It's not all unicorns and rainbows. Like, there are certainly things that we are not able to do as easily as hire for jobs and job classifications that are well-defined. Rick, I don't know if you share that point of view. Maybe there are other groups of jobs or other roles you found were more challenging.
I would have said before we hired Phoebe that the hardest job to hire was the deputy role, in part because it was a bit of a jack of all trades requirement. And in the most classic sense, we were understaffed and overworked, and I had no deputy, but I had no time that I could allocate to hiring last summer when I really could have used Phoebe, as it turns out. It just ended up getting pushed back. Beyond that, I think more sort of categorically, I think Phoebe's answer is exactly spot on. Tina's question about adjacent areas tackling next. I mean, I'll give you a great example. I talked about or alluded to that there are several other things that are currently not great. All job postings across the state post through a central site. That site is a product, is responsibility of CalHR, the HR department for the state of California. They do a phenomenal job, period. They do a phenomenal job, particularly when you consider just how few resources they have for an employer that employs 250,000 people in the state of California. That said, the job application process is we'll say, I think defensively, not designed with the candidate experience in mind, such that it leads to a frictionless process where the candidate fully understands what's being asked of them at each step along the process. And I'll share two relatively minor examples with, I think, potentially big compounding effect. One, when I post a job today, if we're hiring on our team, and I paste the URL of that job into LinkedIn, the social snippet that gets generated by LinkedIn talks about an exam and includes the monthly income range for that job. It doesn't give you the job title, and it doesn't even look pretty because there's no image that goes along with it. It is the least desirable shared URL that probably gets shared on LinkedIn on a given day. If that looked more appealing or inviting, even just the click-through traffic of people who might be intrigued to say, oh, what is that job? That sounds interesting, instead of exam, and here's how little you'll get paid. Mm-hmm. Like, I think we might increase the people at the top of the funnel slightly if we focused on what does the candidate want as opposed to what do the words on the page say. And the second, I want to elaborate on something Phoebe pointed out that we need to remind ourselves of continuously, which is people who've never worked at the state before do not understand this process that has accreted over years and in some cases even decades of convention and rules. So today, when you go to Cal Careers and you see a job listing, right next to the job title is a button that says apply now. If you have been told, oh, I really think you should apply to this job, here's the link, and you hit the apply button, you will never see the fine print below that says failure to attach statement of qualifications, SOQs, will result in your application not being considered. Which itself, I might be getting a few of the words wrong, but what it doesn't say is attach SOQs or we won't even look at your application. And I was talking to one CIO at another department the other day who said 80% of our jobs, or the applications, don't have SOQs because people who are applying for these jobs don't know that that's a thing, and nothing in the subsequent application form indicates that it's a requirement. And by the way, by rule, and this is not a convention, this is a rule, if I see someone's application has come in and we're before the deadline, and I see that they don't have SOQs, I can't reach out to them and tell them that they're missing their SOQs, because that would be preferential treatment to one of the applicants. So when you think about the candidate experience, if we could work on improving that to me is one of the biggest levers we could push on and improve hiring across the entire state.
Yeah. I totally agree. There's a question here from Beth. I think we have time for at least two more questions. How much did the pay bonus equity gap, or the compensation gap between private and public sector, end up being a factor in your hiring successes and failures? I was trying to reflect back as I was reading this question, how much this truly came up. And I want to say not as much as you might expect. While we do, get questions around how much the public sector is able to pay and the flexibility with that, a lot of the conversations that Rick and I had early on, especially around the referral process, were really more oriented toward what OET as an organization is aspiring to do. And it was more about the work outcomes and the environment that we've built. That's not to say that people aren't interested in getting compensated. Obviously, it so happened that a lot of the folks who had been referred by our employees were more focused on a shared mission, on the degree of impact they could make in a role. And so I think that value proposition certainly worked in our favor. Now, we do face challenges with, product managers and hiring product managers. And when we really commit to making that a priority on our team, I can only imagine this question is going to come up a lot and is probably going to be the reason that we aren't able to close certain candidates, because it's just, people make decisions based on that, and we can fully respect it. I heard something once at a conference that I thought was a very thoughtful answer to this. And it was, if pay is the reason that someone does not want to move into the public sector, then they probably are not the right person for the role. Because at the end of the day, we want people to stay and we want people to thrive. And you really will only be able to do that if the reason you wake up every day is because of the impact you're going to make and because of the mission that you share with your coworkers. And it's really hard to retain people who are not driven by that. And there's nothing else we can give them, right? We wish we could, but there's nothing else we can give them. So, at the end of the day, probably not the best answer, but certainly we didn't see it as much in the hiring process, at the end of last year, early this year.
Yeah, I will say there are a couple of candidates that we did lose, that we were at offer stage, where in one case, it was a woman in the private sector who quite naturally assumed in the past she had been able to negotiate from an offer and assumed that, okay, well, I'll do that again here. And that is not the case. Like, I have legal restrictions that establish the hiring band, and that's all I can do. In another case, we had somebody whose current private sector salary was a full 40% higher than what we could offer at the state. And we tried to get an exception to pay above a certain minimum that we are required to start with, and we were not able to do so. So it is a constraint. To Phoebe's point, in the end, it didn't prevent us from putting good people in each of these roles, but there were a couple of cases where it did prevent us from getting certain people added to the team.
Awesome. We are at time. That flew. If you do have questions, find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. We are around. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for spending this time with us. We know your time is precious. Enjoy your week, and hope everyone has a good one. All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye.